Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. This lesson is part of an extended discussion on identifying potential root causes for eventually building a data collection plan, or DCP. In this lesson, I'll pick up from where we left off, where we had narrowed down the potential root causes identified in the C&E matrix, and show you how you can use those to build the DCP. It's essential that you at least review all the previous lessons that first introduced you to the DCP. So for now, let's quickly review again how the DCP can fit into this discussion on identifying root causes. Remember, what we're trying to do here is to build the transfer function. That's the y equals f of x. In order to do that, we have to begin with trying to build the data collection plan, or the DCP. So we should already know what the project y is. So now we need to find out what are those potential x's for that transfer function. And it's the data collection plan that's going to help us ensure that we have enough data for measuring that y and every one of those x's within the transfer function. So what we're going to review again is the overall method for how we might build the DCP. And started off with, as an input to our meeting with the team, it's going to begin with making sure we have the defined phase items, which would also include the y and the defect definitions. All those things that we should have up to this point, make sure we have those already defined before the meeting even begins. And then for the meeting itself, the process that will actually follow during the meeting is going to begin with this next step, which is validating the y and the defect definition with the team to make sure they agree with it. And next we want to identify what are all the potential x's that the team believes are the x's that could be part of that transfer function. Well, we might use several tools again, like the cause and effect diagram, which is also the fishbone and Ishikawa diagram, and also the 5 whys tool. Once we've identified the potential x's, then we move on to the next step, which was narrowing down those potential x's to what we consider to be the most critical x's. This is where we might use the cause and effect matrix, or the C&E matrix, to figure that out. Then the last part here is an output from the meeting. What we're going to do is our last step is to build the data collection plan, that DCP, for those critical x's we identified. And this is where we're going to use something like the sample size calculator, as well as consideration for the short and long-term data and the data collection plan, in order to build this final data collection plan from this process. Now let's define exactly what the DCP is and show you an example of one. Well, the data collection plan, or DCP, is a detailed plan that describes exactly all the data elements that are necessary for your data collection and who will acquire that data in order to properly measure the potential root causes that were identified. So for the purpose of the DCP, it's to define what data is to be collected and the precise method for how it's going to be collected. It's a way of also unifying the team around the purpose of collecting the data and how it aligns to those potential root causes that the team identified. It's also a way to keep the team accountable for ensuring that the data is collected in the prescribed manner. Now, here's an example overall of what a DCP might look like, an example that is built within Excel. And what we're going to do is we're going to break down this into 4 different sections, and then we're going to take this section by section so you can understand how this is constructed. Okay, now let's talk about how to build the DCP by reviewing the various sections it contains. Well, building the DCP can get very detailed. So because of that, we got to move really quickly in order to maintain momentum within this meeting to keep your team fully engaged. So an effective method for doing that is to try to fill up the DCP one section at a time. And I would recommend possibly following this type of order. First of all, starting with the causes to measure. This section is what ties the DCP to the list of causes that were identified previously in the C&E matrix. Starting there would be a great place to start since you already have that information. Next, this is the data sources section. This is the heart of the DCP that's really prescribing what data it is that you need to collect and how you're going to collect it. Then the third section is this data collection summary, this upper section. This is what's going to summarize the entire plan, describing the general source and context for the collected data and any other relevant information about the sample size. And the last section will be the status. This is actually something that would be reserved for the future when you want to track the status for how you're collecting the data. So now what I want to do is break down each of these different sections in this prescribed order, and so you can see what these elements are all made up of in the DCP itself. Well, in this template we have several examples of the C&E diagram and the 5 whys that's combined, as well as the C&E matrix and this data collection plan that we're looking at right now. We'll break this down section by section. Let's start with the first section we described as the causes to measure. And this is the section that was coming from the C&E matrix. So all these references over here, like the C&E number, is referring to the number in the C&E matrix where we've identified over here in our list of all the potential root causes we work through. and we're really only going to be pulling the ones that have a high ranking from the CNA matrix. We're going to exclude the ones that have low rankings, such as these down here. So we're going to at least pull 1 through 5 and this 8th one. That's going to show up in our data collection plan. Here's the 1 through 5 plus the 8th one. We skip the other ones. And then we identified as well, here are those potential root causes, and as well here's that collection logic that we identified, again, all from the CNA matrix itself. The second section that we have is this section called data sources. This is the section where we're identifying in here everything associated with how we're actually going to pull this detailed data. So we're starting off with a new ranking for each item. This is so incremented, so at least we have a fresh number, since the numbers listed over here might be out of order or might be excluding some that weren't included from the CNA matrix. We're starting with a new ranking to identify all the unique data elements we're going to be collecting on here. So next we got the data element column, and this could either be a data field in the system, or it can refer to an existing metric or maybe a brand new metric. So if it's actually for like a data field, it could be the easiest thing to get. All you have to do is just type in the name of the field or the column from where you're pulling the system. Or if it's an existing metric that you have, this could also be relatively easy to get. You just type in the name of that metric and include any additional description about that metric that you're referencing. But if it's a new metric, that's going to be the hardest to get if it's something that you already don't have a measurement for. So you just type in the name that you're going to call this metric and include any other brief description about it. This is the metric that may require collecting and factoring multiple data elements. The next column on here is the data type column. Real simply, this is going to be identified whether this is going to be a discrete or continuous type of data based off of the type of description for whatever data element it is that we've identified. So we just identify, is that going to be continuous or discrete? And next, for the source, that's really going to be telling us where it is we're going to collect that data from. So it could be a system name or report name or some brief general description about where we're going to collect that data. Priority refers to how much of a priority or how essential we think that data element is for measuring the root cause. So we might identify that as high, medium, or low as far as how critical we think it is. And then collection method, that's referring to a description of how, in more detail, of how to collect that data element depending on the type of data it is. So for data field, this is something where if it's a data field, then we might describe the system table and field name or any other relevant information of how we're going to pull it from the system. If it's for an existing metric that we're referring to, then we might describe the specific method for pulling that metric, including the report name or location or some page or reference from a report or a time period for that report, like if it was daily or weekly or monthly report, that kind of thing. Again, we want to get as detailed as possible in the specifics of how we're going to extract that data. If it's for a new metric, though, we're going to describe exactly how the new metric will be calculated, the data sources that will be used, the equation or logic for calculating it, etc. If there are multiple collection methods, then we need to consider splitting the cells or rows to track them separately. So if we happen to have an example in here where there's one type of data element that we're looking at, that we're collecting around, we might see that it's actually going to be comprised of two separate data elements all associated with this one thing we're trying to measure, this one type of potential root cause. So if that's true, then make sure we've got those split out and we're separately tracked, because they may come from different systems or the same system, but it's important for us to at least make sure we identify them separately if it's made up of more than one data element. And then over here on SME, the last piece of this is where we're identifying the subject matter expert, the person who's primarily responsible for collecting that data, the person who's actually going to do this collection for us. If there's a lot of people involved, then it's really important here to identify who's responsible for it, and they have a clear expectation of knowing that they're responsible for it. Now, what if there are going to be multiple data elements needed for each potential root cause? Well, again, you just split the cells that are in here, or the rows, and you want to reflect each of those multiple data elements per root cause. Now, what if the same data element is necessary for more than one potential root cause? Well, that could happen. For example, what's notated on here for this potential root cause, it's a billing rep tenure data element that we would need, but that's also referenced up here in the first one. Well, if that's the case, then just clearly notate it. In this example, we've got it colored a little bit differently, and we have a reference to it in this collection method, so we know this is something that's identified, that's already identified in a separate section. So just be sure that if there is any duplication like that, you've at least identified it. You don't want to leave it blank or exclude it altogether, but it's good to at least notate it maybe in this type of way. So that would conclude the portion for data sources. Now after that, what we'd want to do is start populating this upper section, which is the data collection summary section up here. So for the type of sample data, the first element here, this is a general description of what the final data set should include for analysis. For the next one, identifying the sample data, this is not required, but it could describe the general method, logic, or the intent for the data set and how the data will be evaluated and analyzed. The next section, the time frame of the sample data, well, this should describe the beginning and ending time period represented in the sample data. And this is essential to ensure that the sample data isn't biased and includes all the potential variation. We went in through a separate description as well about the differences between short and long-term variation and short and long-term data and the effects that it could have on variation. So be sure that you account for your time frame very carefully. And also lastly on here, sample size. This is like where we've went through a separate lesson on the sample size calculator. So this would prescribe the appropriate sample size that you would need for this data that you're collecting. And it could vary based off of the data element. So you just need to make sure you specify that. If it does vary by data element, make sure you specify that within this collection method section here. Otherwise, what we would expect is the sample size that's identified will be the sample size that's associated for all of these data elements. So at this point, the DCP will be considered complete. After working with the team, it should be done at this point, even though we've only gone through the first 3 sections. So just be sure at this point the entire team agrees with the data collection plan and that they understand their responsibility as part of collecting the data. If there's anything that has a TBD, like a to be determined item in here as far as a future determination of who's going to be responsible for it, or if there's any statuses that might be TBD, then be sure the team is committed to discussing these further in the future so that way you don't leave it open-ended like that. Now the 4th section referred to is this last one about tracking the status. This section is merely for tracking that status in the future, for the progress of how you're collecting the data, because we're thinking that if it's coming from different data sources and there are so many different data elements, it might take a different amount of time to collect it. So this is just a way to track for that. So consider scheduling recurring meetings with the team in order to track the data collection process, so you can make sure no one's getting behind and everyone's going to be able to meet the expectations for when they can get this data provided. So this will help keep all the SMEs, all the subject matter experts accountable for their part of the process and their commitment to get this data. And keep this data collection plan, this DCP, as a consistent team document to help remind them about why you're collecting this data and why it's so important in the first place. So this could be a great resource for that. Now naturally, not every project will need the detail like this example here for collecting data, and that's okay if it doesn't require it, but sometimes when it does get complex, this is the type of method you can use for tracking the complexity of getting data from many different sources. And again, the goal is we want to get all the data associated with the potential root causes, so that way when we begin our analysis in the analyze phase, we have full confidence we have all the data collected necessary and it represents the right time frame and sample size, so that way we're starting it from the right beginning point when we begin our analysis in the analyze phase.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I'd like you to refer back to the practical application from the prerequisite lesson about how we narrowed down the potential root causes using the C&E matrix. And using that in that prior application, you should have identified and narrowed down those potential root causes, and you might have used it again using the example of trying to reduce your fuel expense or grocery expense or entertainment expense or something like that. Using that as a baseline for this practical application, I recommend you try opening up the spreadsheet template that's provided for trying to build the data collection plan or DCP, and then try to follow through with these steps in building the DCP, starting off with the first section about the causes to measure. This is where you grab the information from that C&E matrix and you embed that within that first section of the DCP. Then try to fill in the second section for the data sources. This is the critical portion of the DCP. This is really where you're going to define exactly what data you're going to collect, where you're going to collect it from, how you're going to collect it, and who will be doing the collection. Now, though this portion may be difficult to complete since what we're working with is a small fictitious example, try to work through it as if it were a large major expense for your organization, as if it were something much bigger, even though we know it's just something on a small, maybe personal scale. But again, the point of this is to try to plan for how you might build a DCP and go through that exercise. And then try to fill in the third section, the data collection summary. Remember, this is the information that will give you the high-level summary about all the data that you're trying to plan to collect within this DCP. And then last, for the fourth section, which is the status section, there's really nothing to add here since this is a fictitious example. Just be aware, though, that that's the portion that you probably would leave blank as part of this practical application.
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.